I'm about to tell you has ruined the silence of suburban nights for me. I used to hear only crickets and the distant hum of the highway. Now, every night as the clock nears midnight, all I hear is the rustle of plastic bags and the pounding of my own heart. My name is Alec, and my neighbor taught me that the most terrifying monsters keep a very precise schedule. The first observation was an accident. I'm a freelance designer, so I often work late. One evening, around midnight, I went to the window to stretch my back. The street was empty and quiet, and then suddenly, the porch light of the house across the street, belonging to Mr. Hetherington, turned on. Mr. Hetherington was the perfect neighbor, a quiet, elderly widower who would only occasionally wave at me while mowing his lawn. I watched as he came out, holding a large black trash bag in each hand. What struck me was their shape. They weren't formless like normal trash. They were almost perfectly cubical and seemed unusually heavy. He silently walked to the trash cans, placed them gently inside, turned back, switched off the light, and disappeared. I glanced at the clock. Exactly 12 a.m. Odd, I thought, and went back to work. But the image of those strange, perfectly formed bags stuck in my head. Establishing the pattern turned my curiosity into anxiety. The next night, around the same time, I went to the window again. I told myself it was just a coincidence, but at exactly 11:59 p.m., Mr. Hetherington's porch light switched on. At exactly 12 a.m., he came out with two identical, heavy, cubical bags and threw them away. And so it went every single night. It became a ritual. I started noticing other details. He was always dressed in the same dark blue work overalls, immaculately clean, as if brand new. After he threw out the bags, he wouldn't go straight back inside. He would walk to his backyard, I could see this from another window, and meticulously wash his hands with a garden hose for a long time, even when it was cold outside. My imagination started to paint horrifying pictures. What could be so heavy and have such a shape? What needs to be thrown out every single night? And what leaves such a mess on your hands that you need to wash them with freezing water? My paranoia began to grow. The quiet, sweet old man was transforming in my mind into a sinister figure with a secret. The attempt to look inside was probably the stupidest and most terrifying thing I've ever done. A week of nightly observations had passed. I couldn't take it anymore. One night, after Mr. Hetherington had gone back inside, I threw on a jacket and slipped out into the street. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid he would hear it. Feeling like a criminal, I approached his trash cans. The smell was neutral, nothing suspicious. I found his bags. They were tightly, almost hermetically sealed with several layers of wide duct tape. I took out a small pocket knife and tried to make an incision. The plastic was thick. When the blade finally pierced it, a dark, viscous, almost black liquid started to slowly ooze from the hole. But the worst part was the smell, a sweetish chemical scent, like a mixture of antifreeze and rotten fruit. It hit my nose, making me gag. I was scared. I didn't know what it was, but I knew for sure it wasn't normal trash. I jumped back from the can, covering my mouth, and ran back to my house, feeling the gaze from the dark windows of my neighbor's house on my back. The disruption of the ritual was the culmination of my horror. One Tuesday, on trash collection day, the garbage truck broke down and never came. The cans on the entire street, including Mr. Hetherington's, remained full. I waited for midnight, holding my breath. What would he do? At exactly 11:59 p.m., the light came on. At exactly 12 a.m., he came out with his 2 bags. He walked to the can, saw it was full, and froze. I had never seen such panic on a person's face. His eyes darted around. He looked up and down the street as if afraid someone was watching. And then he did something I didn't expect. He quickly carried the bags back into his house. For the next hour, I heard nothing. And then a strange, low, vibrating hum started coming from his basement, as if some powerful industrial machine was running. It lasted for about half an hour, and then everything went silent. I didn't know what was more terrifying, what he was throwing away, or what he had in his basement to destroy it when he couldn't throw it away. The unexpected resolution came the next morning. I hadn't slept all night, just watching the neighbor's house. Around 9 a.m., I saw an ambulance pull up to his house. The paramedics carried Mr. Hetherington out on a stretcher. As I found out later, he'd had a heart attack. After he was taken away and the house was empty, unable to restrain myself, I walked over and peered into his low basement window. And what I saw made me laugh and feel terrified at the same time. The basement wasn't a torture chamber. It was a workshop. In the center stood a complex, homemade 3D printing setup, and all around on shelves were dozens of perfectly printed but flawed copies of garden gnomes. Some were missing heads, some had distorted features. And the black liquid and sweet smell, it was just a specific type of resin he was using. I understood everything. He was just an obsessive, quirky craftsman who was ashamed of his failed hobby and got rid of the evidence every night. I felt an incredible sense of relief. But then, as I walked home, a new, cold, clammy dread washed over me. If my imagination could construct such a detailed, terrifying nightmare from absolutely nothing, what else was it capable of? Who was the real monster in this story? The old man printing gnomes, or me standing at my window, imagining dismembered bodies? I've never told anyone this, because when you say you heard something strange and have no proof, people start to think the problem isn't the sound, but what's in your head. Maybe they're right, but I know what I heard, and I know she wasn't alone. My name is Sam. I heard the first conversation on the night I moved in. I'm a student, and I had rented a cheap apartment in an old building with paper-thin walls. As I was trying to fall asleep to the accompaniment of groaning pipes, I heard a voice from the next apartment. It was my neighbor, an elderly woman I had seen earlier, named Evelyn. She was speaking quietly, but her voice was tense. I could hear snippets of phrases. "You can't do that. It's not right. Please, just leave me alone." Her voice trembled. I assumed she was either arguing with someone on the phone or had an unpleasant guest. I rolled over and tried to sleep, deciding not to meddle in other people's affairs. That was my first mistake. The meeting and the denial baffled me. A few days later, I ran into Evelyn in the hallway as she was coming back from the store. She seemed sweet and a little frail. I helped her carry her bags to her door. Trying to make conversation and maybe hint that I could hear everything, I said, "I hope your guest the other day didn't cause too much trouble." She looked at me with her pale blue eyes, and there was nothing in them but genuine surprise. "What guest, dear?" she said softly. "I've lived alone for 10 years, ever since my husband Frank passed away." Her sincerity was so convincing, her surprise so real, that I doubted myself for a moment. Maybe I really had misheard. Maybe it was the TV. I apologized, feeling like an idiot. But that very night, I heard her voice through the wall again, and she was once again pleading with someone to leave her in peace. Now I wasn't just puzzled, I was scared. The two voices forced me to act. The next night, I couldn't sleep. I just lay there and listened, and then I heard it. After another of Evelyn's pleading phrases, there was a reply. It was a low, hoarse, male whisper. I couldn't make out any words, but it was clearly a dialogue. She would speak, he would answer. The worst thought crossed my mind. Someone was living with her against her will, possibly abusing her. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I called the police, anonymously reporting a possible domestic disturbance. 15 minutes later, I heard them knocking on her door. I watched through my peephole. Evelyn answered, looking surprised. She spoke to them calmly and, as I understood, let them inside. 10 minutes later, they came out, and then they knocked on my door. "Did you call, sir?" one of them asked, looking at me wearily. "The woman is perfectly fine, and there's no one else in the apartment. Please don't waste our time with your fantasies." They left, leaving me feeling ashamed, humiliated, and increasingly terrified. Now not just she, but the law thought I was crazy.
The attempt to record was my last hope. I had to get proof. I borrowed a good voice recorder from a friend and one night placed it right against the wall, pressing record. I heard them. They were talking again. Evelyn's voice was filled with fear, and his was low and menacing. In the morning, having barely slept, I retrieved the recorder with trembling hands and plugged in my headphones. I listened to the entire recording, hour after hour. I heard everything: the hum of my fridge, the creak of my bed, the distant sound of cars outside. But in the exact moments when I clearly remembered hearing a conversation through the wall, the recording had nothing but absolute, profound, dead silence. Not Evelyn's voice, not his whisper, nothing. The technology refused to capture the second voice. It was as if it didn't exist for this world, only for my ears. That was the moment I truly began to doubt my own sanity. Maybe the police were right. Maybe I really was going crazy.
The silence that followed was more terrifying than any conversation. One evening, I realized I hadn't heard a single sound from next door for several days. Not Evelyn's pleas, not his whispers. Absolute silence. And it was oppressive, weighing down on me. I couldn't stand it. I went over and knocked on her door. Once, twice. No one answered. Finally, overcome with a bad feeling, I called the landlord, saying I was worried about my elderly neighbor. He came with his master key. We went in. The apartment was perfectly clean, but empty. The furniture, the dishes, everything was in its place, but there were no personal belongings, no clothes in the closet, no photos on the walls. On the kitchen table lay a single sheet of paper. On it, in Evelyn's neat, old-fashioned handwriting, were 5 words. "Thank you for making us leave. He doesn't like being heard." I stood in the middle of the empty apartment, realizing I hadn't been crazy. I had heard the truth, but my actions hadn't saved her. They had only forced the invisible tormentor and his victim to move. I still live in that apartment, and now, every night, I lie in the silence, listening to the walls, terrified that one day I'll hear that familiar, hoarse whisper from my own side of the wall.
Have you ever experienced déjà vu? But what if you started experiencing it for another person? What if your life, your actions, began to be reflected in someone else's with frightening precision? My name is Miles, and my neighbor turned my life into an endless, distorted echo.
I noticed the first coincidence a week after he moved into the house across the street. He was a quiet, unremarkable man of middle age. I took out the trash at 7 a.m., and as I was walking back, I saw him doing the exact same thing. Funny coincidence, I thought. On Friday night, I ordered a pepperoni pizza. An hour later, I saw a delivery guy from the same pizzeria carrying the same kind of box to his door. It was strange, but I chalked it up to us living in the same neighborhood with similar habits. But the coincidences continued. I bought a new garden hose, and the next day, the same hose appeared on his lawn. I mowed my lawn on Saturday, he mowed his on Sunday. They were small things, but the sheer number of them began to bother me. The exact copying became obvious when I realized it wasn't coincidence, but a system. My new neighbor, whose name I didn't even know, was copying my life with a perfect 1-hour delay. On Monday at 6:30 a.m., I left for work in my blue sedan. At exactly 7:30 a.m., he left for work in a blue sedan of the same model. On Wednesday, I went for a run at 7 p.m., wearing a gray t-shirt and black shorts. At 8 p.m., I saw from my window as he ran the same route wearing the same gray t-shirt and black shorts. He never looked my way. He never said hello. He just, like a robot, reproduced my actions, my life, an hour later. He was my echo. I began to feel as if my life wasn't my own, but merely a script that someone else was rehearsing an hour later. And it was driving me insane. I conducted an experiment to finally prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. Maybe it was all just my paranoia. I had to know for sure. One day, I decided to do something completely illogical, something that couldn't possibly be a coincidence. At 3 p.m., I went out onto my front porch, placed a chair in the middle of it, sat down, and began to loudly read a random Wikipedia article about the migration of monarch butterflies. I felt like a complete idiot. My neighbors stared at me with bewilderment. After 5 minutes, I took the chair back inside and hid by the window overlooking his porch. I waited. At exactly 4 p.m., his front door opened. He came out holding an identical chair. He placed it in the middle of his porch. He sat down, he took out his phone, and he began to read something out loud in the same monotonous, loud voice. I couldn't make out the words, but the very act of this absurd, meaningless repetition hit me like a physical blow. My horror was absolute. It was real, and I didn't know what was scarier, the fact that he was doing it or the indifferent mechanical precision with which he was doing it. The confrontation was my most desperate act. I couldn't live in this mirrored hell any longer. One evening, unable to take the strain, I crossed the lawn and rang his doorbell. It took all of my willpower to do it. He answered almost immediately. He looked completely ordinary. Glasses, a house sweater. His face held a mild, polite surprise. "Sorry," I began, my voice trembling. "I'm your neighbor, and I've noticed that you're copying my actions. Please, just tell me why you're doing this." I expected any reaction, anger, denial, fear, but he just looked at me calmly. "I'm sorry," he said in a perfectly even, calm voice. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I think you might be overworked. Perhaps you should get some rest." His absolute calm, his rationality, his complete denial of the obvious scared me more than if he had admitted everything. I stood before him, realizing that my words sounded like the ravings of a madman. and I left, defeated. The shrinking of the delay began the following week, and it was the beginning of the end. One day I noticed he left for work not an hour, but 50 minutes after me. The next day the delay was 40 minutes, then 30. With each day, with each hour, his mirrored life was catching up to mine. The copying was getting closer and closer to real time. I lived in a constant, clammy fear, locked in my house, trying to do nothing to avoid giving him material to copy. But it was impossible. The delay kept shrinking. 10 minutes, 5, 1. One morning I was standing by the window and watched him take out his trash. And a second later, against my will, I felt an almost overwhelming automatic urge to stand up and do the same. My body felt like it no longer belonged to me. And now I don't know what will happen when the delay disappears completely. When we synchronize, will there be only one version left after that? And which one of us will be the original?